Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GEG Spotlight podcast. I am Peter Reeves, along with Matthew Harrison, and we have two amazing guests with us today, James Roach and Mollie Turner. Welcome to you both. James, you are the CEO of the Inclusive Mat, and realistically, you are looking at the big strategic view in your job. And Mollie, we've got you around. You are a boots on the ground therapist. So we've got two really great very different views on the SEND system today. Let's jump straight into this then, okay? What is one digital tool that you have both seen that has completely transformed students' activity in education recently?
Would you like to go first?
I'm going to keep it really simple. So everything we do is about keeping it as simple as we can. And we really try and favour using the technology that's in people's pockets. So really quite simply, just any translation tool. For us, we've got a trust of 4 schools. We've got 60 languages spoken across West Watford, which, is in the middle of Hertfordshire, Leafy Green. But we've got 60 languages. So how do we converse and communicate? So for us, our first forays into digital was around translation. And the simplest way of doing that is with Google Translate, or even latterly WhatsApp Translate. In your pocket, we have got a tool that we carry around with every single one of us. You can click on it, you can get a person to speak into it, and you can have immediate translation. Now, I have to say, I don't use WhatsApp in the classroom. That's obviously a no-no. But when you've got those heated moments with parents who are frustrated, who haven't been to school in England, schools are a terrifying place in the UK, and taking some of that heat out is being heard. So we simply use WhatsApp Translate, and we use Google Translate to just try and to understand what people are saying. Moving that a bit forward, we now use it to translate letters, communication, and the technology is moving really fast, and I'm sure we'll talk about where that's going in a little bit. But yeah, really simply, what's on your computer and what's on your phone.
Yeah, live translation now in Google Meet as well. And if you haven't heard your own voice translated into another language, it is an interesting experience. Mollie, over to you. What is that one digital tool that you've seen that can be really transformative for students?
So I work in a Google reference school, which means that every student has access to a Chromebook. And I think a really nice example of a student who has seen such huge successes because of the access to read write, so screen reader and voice to text, was a student who sat his 3rd GCSE exam today. He did not think he would be sitting GCSEs ever. He can do it independently rather than having a scribe with him, which is something that he really cares about. For his kind of self-efficacy is really big for him. So yeah, I think screen reader and voice to text, the student is dyslexic, and it's absolutely changed his educational, kind of his perception of how he's moved through the educational system.
Yeah, I had a lovely chat with that student a couple of weeks ago, actually, when we were doing a tour, and it was really nice because he's very much really advocating for himself at the moment. Like watching him speak at BET on 2 different stages was absolutely amazing earlier in the year. And he just turned around to these guests that we had who just asked him, where would you be without your Chromebook? And he went, well, I wouldn't be taking exams. I wouldn't have even had the chance to take these exams. So yeah, just that simple, again, the key message there, both very simple tools, just use hyper effectively.
Yeah, we're going to stick with you, Mollie, for a moment, because I think you've got a fairly unique role to the conversations we typically have on this podcast. But you kind of give us a little bit more insight into your role, what you do, and where digital kind of intersects with what you do as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm an occupational therapist, and so OT for short. And OTs can kind of any area of healthcare and education. So I specialize working with children with SEN. But the kind of the main thing that OTs are always striving for is to engage people in meaningful activities that they want to do. Occupation can be lots of different things. For students, it tends to be engaging in play, engaging in social activities, and engaging in learning. And so my role in the school is to support students to overcome these barriers to engagement. And that might be working with them, well, specifically in the kind of realm of digital world, that's working with them to identify how digital adaptive tools can support them overcoming those barriers to engage in learning, in, you know, getting around London. We're a London-based school. We do a lot of work around kind of what have you got on your phone that can support you. Engaging in social things. I know you've already mentioned WhatsApp, but the WhatsApp scribe, is that what it's called, was such a big thing for one of our students, and engaging in the social circles outside of school. So my purpose is a lot bigger than, I think sometimes if you haven't come across an OT before, or you've maybe come across one or two OT assessments in an EHCP or whatever, it's there's lots of different areas of focus. One focus has in the past massively been handwriting. And obviously handwriting is a very complex skill and something that we absolutely should still be working on. But we are moving to a space where there are so many more options for written communication and engaging in the world, that's also something that we're exploring as an OT and working with the school to ensure that people can communicate and access communication the way that they want to and the way they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, fantastic. And then is, you know, to some degree, you're almost like a walking embodiment of like ordinarily available, or you know, it's universal design for learning, that kind of side of things where, yeah, you're looking for what they have readily available, and then work with them and then working with their teachers to support them.
Yeah, absolutely. And a big part of what we do is asking the students, and I think that's really at the heart of OT, is that everyone's different, and that, you know, we might have a student who also uses screen reader, but he uses it in a completely different way to another student, and so it's working with that student to identify how they do it, but then advocate for them and teach them ultimately to advocate for themselves, so that when they go into the world of work, they are able to say, this is how I need to work, this is the setup I need, and these are the digital tools I need in order to be successful in this role.
Yeah, I know that I've spoken to the head of our school recently, and one of our main improvements for next year is building on the success we've had with these accessibility tools and taking it into the workplace with some of our work experience placements and some partners, and helping them develop their systems to normalise these ways of working in the workplace to really help that student advocacy at the next level.
I think sorry to jump in.
Go for it. Yeah.
You know, we're taking it a step further. I'm thinking of it from a strategic level, and everything Mollie you say there is absolutely spot on. But we've got a hurdle to jump before that. You know, I work in West Watford. This in Hertfordshire. That is a very, very affluent area in the country, let alone the world. 12% of our children don't have access to the internet. Now, we're talking about a digital landscape, digitally native children that don't have that access. If you combine that with our family dynamics, so 85% of our children are from the global majority, non-white British. If you are a Pakistani Muslim family, you've got 5 boys and 1 girl. Now, I'm not saying this for everyone, but we've got good examples here. That girl doesn't get the first crack of the whip on the one family computer, the one family PC. The boys tend to get their homework out the way, do a bit of gaming, and then they're sort of last in line. So how do we have a responsibility, should I say, to ensure that there is choice, there is access. Now, are we going to give a device to all 7 children? Well, that's one option, but we know that funding is really, really tight. So how do we build that sustainably and safely? How do we give dignity beyond the classroom to actually just have access and basic access? And that's the biggest struggle we've got at the moment. And you know, and it's through talking with the likes of Matthew and Peter and the way that you've set your schools up that we're sort of learning, because we're right at the start of our journey then. We've not got it right yet, but that is our aim. We've got to get children having access before we can do any of those things.
I think part of that is looking at how we're planning our school day and what expectations we are putting on at home. Like, I think it's a wider question of how much learning belongs within the school environment and how much belongs outside of it. And if we're talking about access, there's only ever going to be so much that we can control in demands of access. I was having this chat with a friend of mine that works for a local authority and deals with lots of immigrant families that have come over, that have emigrated over, and they might not necessarily be in the best places themselves financially. And for me, it really is looking at how can we as a school help that learning environment and build on it. Now, we're really quite lucky in our environment where we're now 8 years into being a Google reference school, which means we've had 8 years of cycle of computers. So actually what I've got is I've got enough old computers. Now, we're not talking about good quality computers, but they are good enough for us to still be using and for us to be able to go, right, these have seen their lifespan in the classroom, but now we have a bank of them that we can send home for students that need them. And even in our school, which is a private SEND school, we have students that don't always have access to those tools at home. And we are now in a position where we can provide those. And I think looking at the Google infrastructure, and especially looking at Chrome OS Flex, have we got old community devices that we can Chrome OS Flex, get larger lifespans, and then get back out into the community that way? And I think those are really important ideas to bring forward, and again, like local business and looking at our own systems and how we can build on that and help give access to those things. Interestingly, when we spoke to in a previous podcast, when we had the teacher that was in a war-torn area, one of the things that she said was that she makes sure that in the morning they turn their Chromebooks on and they download everything and have it ready to learn in offline mode. So everything's downloaded in the morning that's needed, prepared in advance. And then those students, if they need it, if they lose internet connection or they don't have it or there is a power cut, they still have everything they need on that computer to then be able to use.
I think it's about ensuring that the digital divide or any divide doesn't get bigger as a result. You know, our trust motto is happy children and young people learn. Now, that doesn't change whether you're in a classroom or on a screen. Our job isn't to make sure that the screen, our job is to make sure that the screen doesn't become another barrier. We were talking to a company called Meshy, some of you would have heard of, and we didn't work with them, but they look at, you know, just like you would your home mesh system, we've got 4 schools that are really within a kilometre of each other. Can we utilise that internet that we pay for constantly and send that out and let children have access to that? Now, the benefits of that include safeguarding. We know what they're looking at. We know what we can filter and block, and we can give access within just the remit of what we're already paying for. So there's some inventive ways to look forward. But I think if you go back to what you said, you know, our environments, they're just not built for a modern digital system. So how do we flip that on its head and make them that way?
I think that brings us nicely on to the next talking point here for you, James, as well. We've talked about that wider community. Now let's really focus in on the classroom. With the DFE SEND improvement plan emphasis, how are we looking at changing those classrooms and adapting those physical spaces with the idea of technology? What is this? What is the addition of technology going to allow us to do with these physical spaces?
You know, one size fits all fits no one, and that's been our curriculum since the Victorian times. You know, me and Peter, we've chatted about this. We weren't model pupils at school, Peter. I don't think I'm revealing anything there. No. And the system didn't fit me. And you know what I've learned as a teacher, what I've learned as a head is that we've got to be driven by the children's needs. I think EYFS gets it absolutely right, and I got into a bit of a to-do about this with some trust leaders recently. We take our EYFS environment and we let children go for it. We let them colour mix, we let them do paint, and then we get them into year 1 and we sit them down and we squeeze the paint out for them, we tell them to comply. We've got a chance to digitally have an EYFS open sandbox infrastructure by giving them the tools they need, and then the way that they interact it through the accessibility tools, through some of the things that Mollie's talked about, and also through their own curiosity. I think that's how we build that digital environment. You know, we still need schools. COVID proved that we're never going to have, or in my view, certainly in my time, we're never going to have a robot teacher controlling 200 children in a hall. We need human connection. So what our digital environment can do is give us the freedom to be you, to be your own learning style. And I know, Peter, I've seen some of your wonderful students and the learning diet. You know, you've got a map of what each student, how they best learn. If I knew how I learned going into university and going into teaching, going into be head, I'd have been a lot more, well, I'd have saved myself a lot more sleepless nights. I know that. So do our classrooms need to change? They probably can't, if I'm being honest. You know, we've got Victorian buildings that are grade 2 listed buildings. We can't change them. but we can change how we plug into those buildings. Taking that screen away, I've seen some great schools where it's Chromecast or it's Applecast onto a wall, it's movable, and we're not absolutely fixated with that environment. But the digital environment allows us the dignity to be in a room together, but have the accessibility tools that mean that we can access things in the way we want to and need to.
I would say if you are Chromecasting onto a wall, to be careful. One of my first experiences in teaching, when I was back at the NEAT unit in Romford, we had this at the time brand new bit of tech, a projector on the wall that was touch sensitive, so you could project it onto the wall. It was touch sensitive. The first thing I did was swipe my finger across it, not looking at the texture of the wall, and it was rough, and I burnt off my fingerprint and couldn't really poke anything for a couple of weeks. Just a complete side note there for you.
But I mean, yeah, and just on that topic, we're getting to see some really exciting things. There's a bit of a trend from Liverpool. I think we all know Maryville, where if you go into their classrooms, they've kind of rethought that layout. They've got a traditional 2x2 classroom, but actually, I want to call it a bit coffee shop-esque, how they've started to lay out their tables and their seating arrangements, and it is a bit different, and in a very, very good way, in a very positive way. It comes down to dignity when you have that conversation with them. And other schools are starting to look and view that. I've seen one school who's starting to put, I would say, conference tables within their classroom, so they've got more screens around the classroom that children can now plug into. This isn't a private school. Before people go, "Oh, this is going to cost a lot of money." This is state funded. But yeah, so children can plug in and go, "Oh, look what I've been doing." This is, and showcase in smaller groups their learning in that lesson.
There's a great school over in Ireland, and I can't remember its name off the top of my head, and I really want to get over there. But they've completely made the most of basic old television screens, but they've put them everywhere within their school, and with Chromecasts, and students can just Chromecast to any of these, and they can put up their own work, they can suggest friends' work, and all of these screens are completely accessible to just show off learning in the corridors, in shared spaces. I really want to get over there and get feet on the ground and see it. Yes, James.
If any of you've got 5, 6, 7-year-olds of your own, you will know when they go on their iPad or their tablet or all of that time, they almost sit upside down, legs on inverted. None of them sit like we sit in school. There's loads of research that shows that our model of how we sit and face doesn't work. In one of our classes, we've got beanbags, we've got high chairs, we've got spinny chairs. We've been really trying for a year different sitting places. Has it had a massive impact on learning? I can't tell you, but I know it's had an impact on behaviour and therefore attention and therefore learning. So, we're all for it. You've got to have some order. You've got to have some way of coming together. But, the movability of our tech now really helps us with that environment.
And it's a shame some of those things that don't get that, I want to say, traction, or, sometimes the hard bit of education is that promotion of things, right? There's no real adverts of, this school's doing this, this school's doing that. Again, about 10 years ago, I remember visiting a school in Croydon at the time, and they doing exactly what you've just kind of explained, but they were free-form entry school, and they'd knocked down some walls. So instead of having 3 classrooms, they had one big space, and in that big space they had a beanbag area, tall tables, small tables, whatever. But once the pupils had been kind of set off on the task, that they were then allowed to choose where they sat and how they sat, and there wasn't like, you have to sit this way, you have to sit up in a normal chair. And again, it in some ways quite ahead of its time. They'd obviously borrowed from you go to Google offices or whatever, and you kind of start to see that that's what they promote in some ways as well. But we're going to get onto a bit more of a contentious subject, and I've got my finger ready to make sure Peter's muted throughout this next question. But the white paper. So obviously we've had the recent SEND white paper. I'm just going to kind of keep it simple and just start with your initial thoughts, feelings from your perspective. So I'm going to start with you, Molly.
Sorry, I was reading your questions and I wasn't listening to what you were saying.
I'll have it. Thoughts and feelings on the white paper.
I find my position within like the education system really interesting. I don't have a background in education. I'm not trained in education, and actually I was raised in a healthcare system in terms of my profession, and I've only seen one school. I've only worked in one school, so I feel like I'm not the most well-versed person to comment on things, to be honest. Sorry.
We're going to get a more detailed answer from James, we know, so I'm kind of saving him.
Yeah.
So there's what lens am I looking through? As a MAT leader, consolidation is becoming an expectation. We're a small MAT that serves a very specific area. We do it really, really well. We don't financially need to grow at the moment, but we're being told we have to grow. Now, the stuff we're implementing at the moment is relatively simple and straightforward, and therefore impactful because we've got scale and we've got community. The risk there is that the policy focuses on structural tidiness rather than actually improving outcomes and growing for growing's sake. Digital is it's pretty invisible, isn't it? Really, in the white paper, it's got an undertone with accessibility. I think that's quite telling. I don't think the government. You are quoting me on this. I'm going to tell everyone. I think the government haven't thought about it through this lens. We've got an AI toolkit that's out now, which is, I think, really great for now. But how fresh and how repeated is that going to be? AI is reshaping teaching and learning faster than policy is moving. That's for sure. AI is impacting on children before it's impacting on teachers. So we've got a bit of a topsy-turvy thing. My true feeling is I'm actually fairly hopeful, if this white paper came to fruition, that actually it's got the right leaning for SEND. It talks about unpicking predictable need, and I mean that respectfully. Neurodiversity in some cases is predictable. I've got ADHD myself. I think there is predictability in my behaviors that could have been picked up at school. That leaves funding for high level. Is it going to get through? Are we going to actually have a white paper that delivers? I'm not as confident. I think MAT leaders can speak coherently about the gaps that they have and the gaps that technology could support them with. I think what I would really hope from it, you haven't asked me this, but I'm going to give you it anyway. What I would hope from a further white paper with a digital lens is that work around digital dignity, digital levelling up. We all got those COVID devices and those things, and they were great for the moment, but they weren't long term. Are we going to have a digital pathway that are going to follow our children? I'm thinking about all the things strategically we're doing for my primary school children, but they're going to go off to 7 or 8 different secondary schools, which might be a Microsoft school, might be a Google school, might be a whatever school. And is there any consistency and continuity that could come into place? And I think the SEND channel is probably where that white paper could really harness that without it having to be mandated as digital. Mollie, you've talked about some of those brilliant adaptations. Let's make that pathway really, really clear and definite for those children. It's definitely the only way we're going to deliver on scale a solution to support those children's learning needs and the teaching of those children's learning needs.
And I'm just going to pick up on that DFE point as well, because I remember it was probably 2 or 3 years ago at this point. I had a member from the DFE digital team that I was speaking to visit one of our schools, and I'm kind of saying, do you think it's ever going to be a push from the DFE to mandate devices essentially long term? Do you think that's going to come in because it's becoming, at the time, becoming more and more trendy? And their answer was essentially they didn't feel that was going to happen because they didn't think they could do it without being. They wouldn't be device agnostic. They felt like they'd have to suggest a path, and they didn't feel comfortable saying we suggest Google or Apple or whatever. So that was our kind of view at the time, which was quite interesting. We can. I think we've proven again with things like the EdTech partnership, it doesn't have to be that way. And yes, we're talking on a Google leaning podcast, but yeah, we know many colleagues who do it in other ways. So it was quite an interesting point from the DFE that
I think that the way to get around that is looking at attainment and looking at assessment. And I've heard Peter speak more than enough to know exactly what rant he's going to go off on here. But the fact, the data just from Abingdon House alone shows that children's achievement is being blocked by a bullishness to not allow a different way of assessing.
Mhm.
So we could say we are device agnostic. Let's get it right though. If we said we were Google or Microsoft as a government, they'd get a great deal, wouldn't they?
Yeah,
There's all sorts of moral things about data and all of that sort of stuff.
and it's really interesting as well. I mean, because it's almost a problem for England, right? And rather than you look at Scotland and what Scotland are doing, and I got to sit on a panel with Everway at Beck, with a lady from Scotland who had been a huge part in kind of bringing in digital across countless councils in Scotland, and they'd made a choice. You hear other places who have made a choice. I was speaking to someone today who was telling me who's got the contract for Scotland and bits like that. So it's quite interesting to hear all these little bits going on in the background.
So my question would be, is it, the problem I've got with it, this is not children first. The children we serve deserve more than just to be a footnote in the national education policy. Those children, our children, it's absolutely necessary that some of those children are assessed using screen readers, using, writing, speech, text to speech. But we're blocking it. Now, is this, do we still hanker after a curriculum that children teach, that teaches knowledge? The children today are not going to sit in a pub and do a pub quiz. They're not going to access information in that way. And there's a bit of joy that gets lost from that. But they are going to be so fluid with instruction, with prompting, with the specificity, he says, not being able to say it, of language. It's so key now. So how do we help them do that? Because that's not being assessed. We're still going back to the core text that we all read or didn't read and half memorized and got a tick in a box. I think that the biggest tell is this curriculum review. What is the actual computing curriculum going to say? At primary level, we're not going to be learning spreadsheets anymore, that's for sure. Is there a need for coding in the way that we're doing it now? Probably not. What is the need going to be? Can we build a curriculum for the future? Probably not. But can we build a curriculum that is agile and fluid and goes with children's interests and uses digital as a tool? So I think I'd like to see digital being used as a golden thread for a teaching and learning tool rather than being an assessed thing or a curriculum thing.
And just to jump in, as somebody who's kind of built a career on, I would say, being a glorified computing lead, and that's where it all started for me, that, I completely agree. Like, I'm often having conversations now going, why are we doing coding? Let's not do coding. Like, in primary schools, is it relevant? Like,
I mean, I'll just take you back to the post 16 podcast that we had with Roddy, and he said that one of the things that he wishes schools taught more, and I got to pull my smug face because it's one thing we do at our school, is teaching how to send emails properly and learn. Like, I think when we get down to that idea of digital literacy, it's that idea people think students are digitally literate because they can use YouTube. That doesn't make them digitally useful and skilled in the way that you need in the working world. I would just say, because we are talking about the white paper, just to cover myself, the views
you've got 1 minute.
The views I'm going to express at some point today are the views of myself and not the views of my school or the company the school is belonging to. They are solely my views.
Yeah, and I agree with you. But if I look at how I've got a 7-year-old and a 12-year-old, if I look at how they interact with Alexa, keep it really simple. They talk to it. There's a humanness to it. Now, that's not fake or false, but they are modeling and practicing the humanness of being human. Now, we can get into, and we talked about this in the EdTech partnership, of what it is to be human. It doesn't get sarcasm. It doesn't get those deeper things. But that, if we talk about a curriculum, they're talking about digital identity versus real identity. They're talking about safeguarding. They're thinking about the creation, not the consumption of knowledge and information. They're talking about civic literacy rather than formal literacy. They talk about economic literacy. I heard the term, I don't know if I was with you two, I heard the term did AI vegan the other day. Was I with you?
It was Mac here in digital, yeah.
Yeah, they talk about the term AI vegan, how some young people, are choosing not to use AI because of the impact on the ecosystem and ecology. Now that's not come from anyone my age. That's come from them as a group of young people who care and who have had good education. So it's going to change.
Really interesting. I don't know if you saw Darren White's recently. Like, Darren White recently did a little diagram of that and kind of explaining, well, like, this is how much usage, water wastage AI causes, this is how much water wastage, in a 3-minute shower in comparison, or watching TV in comparison. It's quite interesting to go, well, yeah, it's bad. Yeah, there's doing this, but it's in context. You look across what we do every day. You kind of got to minimize everything then.
But the children are still curious, and we forget about the problem with the mandated curriculum is we lack the children's curiosity. I had a great question from a year 3 the other day. How do algorithms decide what they see? What a brilliant question from essentially an 8-year-old. That's amazing. I couldn't tell him.
Also, before Peter, I know Peter's waiting to do his question, but the comment about AI being sarcastic, I completely disagree. You can make it sarcastic. Luke Craig is a primary example of that. He, now working for Google, but as he left his school, he left them with a Gemini Gem to kind of answer basic AI, basic questions about things like Wi-Fi passwords and all that kind of thing. But he made sure that it answers sarcastically. So when they ask, what's the Wi-Fi password, their reference, like he's made it so it references him, kind of, gives him a bit of a dig, goes, oh, so much for Luke, blah blah blah. But has this sarcastic twist.
So it mimics sarcasm. Can it recognise sarcasm coming back?
Yeah.
That's the next one. So there you go.
I was actually having that discussion with some students the other day about, is it you need to tell an AI to be sarcastic? Would it be sarcastic by itself?
Yeah. So you can make it sarcastic, but it'd be interesting to see it the other way.
So we've a massive amount there, touched on loads of places. Let's have a think about the idea of a sensory balance when we're looking at digital. So Molly, we're going to come over to you first of all. Technology can be a savior. It can, as we've already said, it can enable learning where it might not take place otherwise. But how do we balance that when we're thinking about a sensory approach, a very busy environments? How can we bring that idea of a balance and a sensory balance when we are looking at these devices and these approaches?
Well, I think it's a really interesting question, because I would challenge that as what difference is it using a Chromebook or a computer laptop to learn than using a exercise book and looking at a whiteboard. In terms of
just so it's okay to say Chromebook on this podcast.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Google Educator Group.
Not going to get penalised.
No. We're not allowed to say the other ones.
Yeah. Don't mention the others. Chromebook, great.
Okay, so what is the difference of learning from your Chromebook? So on your Chromebook, at least the way that if you are using the Google Suite and you're using Google Slides, you often have what you would be looking at on the board and your work in one place. So in terms of the visual sensory environment, actually you're reducing it for the students because they're not having to look up and down as much. For a lot of students who have really poor visual perception, which is a lot of your SEND students, it can be incredibly overwhelming being in a busy classroom. So actually having one space to look is, for some people, and again, I really liked what you said earlier, James, about one size fits all fits no one or something, because that is essentially the motto of OT. But for one person, looking at the whiteboard might be absolutely what they love to do, but for other people, having it reduced to the screen in front of them is really, really helpful and really beneficial for their learning. I really liked as well what you were saying earlier, James, about classrooms exploring different seating and having the mobility of a laptop or a screen, or you've got like iPads or something like that, to be able to sit on seating that supports them sensorily. So you've got ADHD students, you might need them on a spinning chair so that they're listening. You might need people on beanbags. You might need people standing up at the back. Might need people pacing across the room. If they can have their device with them as they move, I think it opens up a space in a classroom that makes the classroom much more sensorily available for a lot of our students. Something that a lot of the young people that I work with, what they really struggle with is sitting at a desk writing in a book. That does not work for them. And I think the more and more that I speak to people in my life, like people who have gone through the education system, it didn't work for most people. And you don't have to have any kind of neurodivergence to have struggled with that. If you think about how you work day to day, I never sit straight on a chair. I always have my legs crossed. I often am back to front on my spinny chair, and I am neurotypical. I think that having accessibility to technology just really can level the playing field in terms of making the classroom a centrally available space for SEND children.
Can I say that we talk endlessly about screen time, positives, negatives, in-betweens. We almost never talk about what does replace it, because I've seen some really rubbish lessons that are well boring. And I would question how and what we do to replace it. Everyone's read The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt, and it talks about, we're replacing play-based childhood with a phone and digital-based childhood. We overprotect in the real world and underprotect in the digital world, and that's all true. He talks about the arm break thing. There are not enough children breaking arms and legs anymore, and I think he's right. So, you've got to have a balance. It's a balanced diet of education. Without a shadow of a doubt, Molly, you said it so eloquently and beautifully there. There are children whose nervous systems process the world so differently. A screen can regulate or dysregulate. For me, the buzzing of certain electricity in rooms drives me insane. So, and then other people just don't hear it, and I can't. That blows my mind. So, again, one size fits all fits no one. A blanket rule about how much we have just does not work. It's the same as year sixes when they go up to the canteen, and I've got this year six that's bigger than me and wants 5 sausages, and I've got this tiny little one that wants 1 sausage. We've got to have agility, or we've got to be given license to have agility and flexibility. That's got to come from the top. Ideally, the government. If it's not the government, it's got to be our trust leaders. It's got to be people like myself that are running trust and being brave and saying this works for our children. Yes, we've got Ofsted. Yes, we've got those things, but being playful, getting it right for our children is the joy of why we do our jobs. And I think you said it brilliantly there, Molly. We've got to give them that choice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just on that point you raised there, James, I think I've particularly Essex, Hertfordshire way, my side of that map. I've seen that rise in like the Opal play.
We've got it in our schools. Yeah, it's brilliant.
Yeah. And so we got in quite a few of our schools, and it's kind of again naturally grown out. So yes, we do digital and we do one-to-one devices, but actually we've also invested heavily in Opal Play and making sure that's part of that childhood. And somebody my daughter's school does it, and there's like a 20-mile difference in where I work and where my daughter goes to school, and all these little bits. So it's, again, there is this movement back towards it a little bit with Opal Play becoming quite popular.
For those who don't know Opal, they furnish the school with with things to do. We've had a box of feathers. Every child had a feather, and they would just brilliantly bonkers wandering around the school blowing feathers around. The next week we had a load of suitcases and they were going on holiday. But actually, I think we could probably learn from that, because at what point did we stop doing that ourselves as teachers and parents and children? And actually, the danger of digital is, yes, too much of it means we go into that digital world and we don't experience that. So it comes back to balance and insisting. We will have parents that say, I can't get my child off the device. And I sort of think, well, why not? Why not? And actually, there's a whole conversation around that as well. So I think we've got a responsibility to model Opal-like play and outdoor play. But we've got a responsibility to model good use of devices as well.
I would just jump in on that. You summed up there perfectly there, the good use of devices. There was a phrase heard a lot a few years ago, which was, well, don't just use a computer to replace a worksheet. And my question was like, why not? Why? If you can make a worksheet more accessible, why not just replace? If you've got a great worksheet and you can make that worksheet more accessible by having on a computer, do it. Computers, they don't have to be all singing and dancing. You don't have to have an app for everything. You can use these really simple, basic tools so effectively to just help engagement. That's why, like, especially with the screen time debate, I'm often like, there is no such thing as too much screen time, as long as that screen time is purposeful. And you are learning with it. And then there is no such thing. There is, like Molly said earlier, there's no difference between a book and a computer if the student prefers the computer, and you're not forcing that choice onto people, and you are giving them well-informed information of their metacognitive processes and allowing them and help guide them down that process for how they learn.
Yeah, and I just jump in there because something you said has reminded me of another kind of leveling of the playing field that you can use through having digital kind of personal devices. And it's something that Pete models all the time in his lessons, is that he records himself giving the instructions and inserts it into their worksheets. So as they're doing their worksheets, most of our students struggle with recall of instructions. Most of them struggle with sequencing, task initiation, a lot of the executive functioning skills. And so actually, yeah, you've just kind of digitalized the worksheet, but at the same time, you've got those supports embedded in the worksheet, which means that the teacher's not running around having to help everyone, or a child sat there not engaging in the learning because they don't know how to ask for what the instructions are. And I think that's another like really good leveling of the playing field. And that's just one example of how kind of using digital tools wisely is really supportive. Yeah.
The ability to choose. I mean, lots of us have been to see Woodlands and Leo and some of these brilliant schools, and including we're off to see your school tomorrow, Matt, aren't we? And what really struck me with Leo is the fluidity in which children choose the app that's right for them, or the physical work action that is right for them. And I think what's really pushed the envelope on that is in the last 2 or 3 years, the pedagogical tech partners have gone up a level. They've stopped a lot of them being computer salespeople that dress it up with education. They are genuine educational partners and educationalists who are actively thinking a little bit more advanced and differently and helping the education. We genuinely see them as partners. Google are right up there. Magma we use, Willow Learn are brilliant. And, I'm sure we could all list loads of them. But they are so much part of our curriculum design now that I don't think that was there 5 years ago in the same richness, definitely.
Yeah, and I think that's hugely important. I always talk about kind of part of the reason Pete and I started doing this podcast is that advocacy for stories and hearing and discussing. And I think it's so important to not be in your silo. People get trapped in their silos quite quickly. But yeah, it's always fascinating when you go and see or hear those amazing things, or even sometimes talking about Bob Usher earlier before we start recording, the stories Bob Usher at LGFL goes around and tells, and now he's kind of made that a national thing, even though LGFL's London based. He's got stories up in Liverpool. He's making a whole chapter of in Essex, and he records. He goes around. Schools don't pay for this service. It's part of the LGFL offer as such, but then you can go and click on the website and go and see these like fantastic stories, and proudly we're within that. And I always talk about how what you're talking about, you're saying, right, James, you're right at the beginning of the journey. We're 2 years into the journey, and by no means are we we're not Leo at all, and we're nowhere near that part of the journey yet. But where our schools have kind of nailed it, we're already seeing that fluidity with those pupils, where they just open the device, they know what they're doing. They've become used to using a certain tool, or we're going to use this today. They're not even thinking about it, they're just on it and actively participating in the lesson.
But the confidence, and I'm going to say, because I had the pleasure of seeing your children, Matt, at their presenting, but also being on that main stage and presenting, the confidence seeps out. Confidence in one thing begets confidence in another. And Peter, we had the pleasure of Peter and the wonderful Mason, one of your pupils, come and lead our entire trust inset. And with that, I'd say it not with any negative. In the 5 years I've done those trust insets, Mason is the number one success in there that they all talk about. We're talking about technology sparking human connection with a mass group of people for ordinary children, ordinary teachers, ordinary staff, and that's the joy of it. So we can talk about the negatives of screen time. Without that, I'm guessing your children weren't standing on those stages without it.
We're going to give Peter a chance to discuss the white paper now. Yeah. I think we're going to be a bit more specific though. You're not just going to give him free reign, because I know that could be a 4-hour podcast in itself. But the future of digital within that white paper, thinking about that, something like a digital EHCP or a digital passport that goes with the child. What does that look like to you in your mind? Is that something viable? Is that something, in my mind, it's something ultimately positive if it comes into fruition of something that can travel from primary school all the way to higher education, perhaps. But I'm going to leave it to you to kind of walk us through this.
So I'll just re-highlight that these are my views and not the views of the school or the company.
Or the podcast.
Or the podcast, yeah. My personal views, I'm to blame for this. It's already happening in some respects. So this is happening. We, as I've talked about before, our school, we have technology diets. It's what we won the TES Award Best Use of Technology for last year. James has mentioned it, that our students are really aware of the tools they need because we have a system around introducing them. We have a system that we can apply that is every child in the school has taken these assessments and every child in the school has their diet. We then look at that technology diet at key stage changes and in their exam year. And it's meant that we've got students going into exams that are fully ready to use these accessibility features. We've then had students go off to colleges. Now, Mason's already been mentioned on the podcast because he is a legend. But he went to a college interview and he turned around and asked them, what do you do for accessibility? And they said, well, we don't really think about it much. And he turned around and walked out of that interview at lunchtime and didn't continue. And I told that story at Bet on the Everway stand, and it got a gasp from the crowd because there were people working in colleges that had never thought a student would just walk out of their college at a drop of a hat. So these things are going on. And again, it's where you've got good links to local schools, where primaries to secondaries and secondaries to colleges and sixth forms. And this is what we're working on, is making that net a bit wider. Lots of our students go to one of our other colleges as part of the group, and we can really communicate with them. And what we're really going to try and do next year is look at that net wider and say, where can we start reaching out to other colleges that we might feed into and make sure they're ready to accept our students with their accessibility needs. The idea of making this national, I think if you look at the white paper's view of technology, I think it's mentioned twice in the whole paper. You look at the first advert they put out from the DFE on the white paper, and it was a student sat at a desk in a plain white room out of a classroom with a piece of paper and 2 coloured pens. Now, that's great if you can handwrite, but if you can't, you've already lost the child. And that was the view. That was the published view of this. So I think if that is their view of what good differentiation for SEND looks like, 2 coloured pens and a sensory pebble, then I think we are missing out part of this, and we are missing out some expertise, and we are missing out on what we know and we have all seen on this podcast can revolutionize children's learning. And I think they've missed a trick in doing it. I think it is down to those schools like Aberdeen's, like your Leos, to make those wider connections. Like James was saying, if it's not going to, it needs to come from top down, and if it's not going to come from the DFE, then it should come to us. And I think that's where we're trying to position ourselves, to put that wider reach out so that the colleges and the workplaces our students are going to go to are ready to accept them with the ways they need to work. And hopefully we will see a knock-on from that, and then they can allow their workers to build more.
I think there is one small glimmer of hope. I'm not fully, but there is talk about co-ownership, children having more voice, parents having more voice. This can genuinely, if this was digitized and made national, it would put the children at the center of their own digital story rather than leaving it to other people. It can make the invisible visible, can't it? What a child needs digitally traveling with them. Equally, it can just replace a bit of paper that doesn't get looked at by people if it's not passed on to schools and it's not moved on. But if this is genuine co-ownership with children and families, the technology is easily there to be able to make that move forward. For my families who they don't have a voice, genuinely haven't been to school in England, and you've got an SEND child, possibly an SEND parent who doesn't speak English, where is their voice? How many barriers they got to go through? Technology could solve that and sort that easily.
Yeah. I think that's where we're looking at next year as well, is looking at how can we empower not just the students, but their families and that whole support around the child to really be aware of how they can access these tools and really, you know, drive their whole access forwards. And speaking for myself personally, like, I'm massively dyslexic, and if I ever went to a school interview that asked me, and I know they still happen today, that asked me to handwrite an essay for them, I would do a Mason and walk out of that interview, because I was having a chat with some of our students, and they were like, well, what if they do that? And I was like, well, then you need to be aware of, is that job right for you? Like, is that environment going to be one that's going to support you professionally? And if I had a leadership team that said, right, you need to write on the board every day, I know that job wouldn't be for me.
This comes back to digital, no, not digital. This comes back to dignity. It comes back to belonging. It comes back to self-worth. It comes back to all those things that we can teach with or without technology. And ironically, if we use technology to take away some of the admin tasks as a teacher, you've got more time to spend with other humans building that with children, because that is what you can't necessarily get from a device at the moment. You need a human to give you that and to empower you to do that. So the irony is, it actually provides what it's taken away.
Yeah, I mean, Molly, you had a great quote when we did Matt P and South, and it's one that I use now in every presentation, which is all of our students were championed by an adult at some point, and you need to be that champion for that student.
Yeah, and I think just taking it back to having like a digital passport, or your students really knowing what works for them digitally, is that at one point they can then go on and advocate for themselves. But they need an adult to advocate for them initially. I mean, otherwise it's not going to happen.
And how powerful is it when they advocate for themselves, you know? And again, we'll circle back to the wonderful Mason and some of the other students that Matt, I've seen of yours and Peter. Blimey, you know what? If I had that at that age, where would you be? They're brilliant. They're fantastic.
We actually had I had a couple of adults come in from another school that were just starting their digital transformation, and they said to our kids, aren't you reliant on this technology? And they proudly turned around and went, yes, we are. Yeah. This is what allows us to access. It's not a bad thing that we're reliant on this, because without that, we wouldn't be accessing it. And that was their message. They were like, yes, and it's not a problem, because without it, what would we, and it goes back to your point, without this, what would we be doing? And one of the girls that was there just turned around and went, in my old school, I used to sit and pretend I was listening. And that's what I'd be doing again, just pretending to listen rather than actually listening.
Yeah.
Same adults who got there using sat-nav, who use their phone to look at their timetable and text and do all that sort of stuff. We are part cyborg. We can't get away from this.
Yeah.
You know, yes, we've not got Neuralinks in our brains yet, but our phone does 95% of the things that we could do on our own, but we don't. Yeah. You know, so why are we fighting it?
I also think, why are we asking students if they're becoming reliant on digital tools? Because digital tools aren't going anywhere. So I don't see the problem with it anyway.
We've got a country that doesn't do maths, can't do maths, yet we took the calculator away, a tool that was built to help us with maths. Yeah, we take that away and test our children. Madness. Yeah.
So we've sort of touched on this in a few points there, actually, that technology is all through our lives now. And it is all through our education. There are so many tools within Google. You've got Google Keep, calendar tasks, Google Classroom, embedded docs, so many ways to organize learning. How are these tools being used to help students with their executive functions? And it can be as simple as, and this is something that I had to explain to our kids, because I asked, oh, what would it feel like if you were carrying 9 books around for each of your lessons? And bless them, our year 11s, because they've been with us the whole time, they had no concept that in another mainstream secondary, they'd have to carry all these books around. And it was something that wasn't there for them. So even that basic level of, well, it's all in one place, was just a winner for them. How are we seeing this shown in everyday life, and how are we helping structure this executive functioning?
Well, I think that if you think about how you yourself use digital tools to support your executive functioning, we are all outsourcing so much of our executive functioning into these tools. And I work quite closely with quite a few students in our kind of year 11 cohort when they're looking at transitioning into a world of work or a world of self-directed study, about how you can use the tools available to them to outsource that executive functioning. You know, it's something that particularly our students with ADHD really struggle with. So why not use the tools available? You know, we have students who will send themselves an email, a scheduled email, that will ping up at a certain time and be like, you need to study now. And then they set their timer, they turn everything off and they do that. That's outsourcing your executive functioning. It's not relying on you to look at the clock and think, what was it I needed to do again? And that's just sending yourself an email. You're not using a specific tool for that. I think that we model it so much as adults and as teachers. I mean, as teaching professions are some of the best people at outsourcing executive functioning. And I don't know what the curriculum looks like because I don't teach the curriculum, but I wonder if that's something that should be built into the curriculum, that actually this is how we can use these tools to support our daily executive skills.
I think just to take that further forward, and you're right, the ADHD thing for me, I use things to help with my executive dysfunction, not to support my executive function. And for me, NFT tags are just the absolute game changer. You would have seen a few people use them online. You know, the little tags that are programmable, same as your hotel card. I've got them in various places where when I'm cooking and I need to, and it's when I end up slowing down and thinking, and I've got one just by the cooker that activates my voice note, which I can then send to myself. I've got one in my car to remind me to take my vitamins, tablets, and I geolocate it. Workflows now, Arbor workflows, some of the workflows you can build within Claude and some of those things are brilliant because it takes the point of failure, which is always me, out of things. And right, it's just pre-programming these things with a simple bit of non-coded programming, because I can't code at all, just by my geographical location or tapping something that I walk past and see. With my brain, I see everything, I just forget to actually connect anything. So I haven't moved, and if I'm honest, I haven't moved that into the classroom yet, but the options for that are phenomenal. But it comes back to personalization again, doesn't it? Also comes back to me not wanting to look, I'm telling you on a podcast, but me not wanting to look stupid. I run an organization, but I don't want to be reminded that I can't remember to pack XYZ in my bag every single day. So there's dignity within that as well. So executive function or dysfunction, however you view it. I think, first of all, we're talking about it. We've got a name for it. We know what it is now. It certainly wasn't the case when I was at school. I was just forgetful or a naughty boy, So actually, there's an acceptance there, but there's also a breaking it down to a granular level and then building it up to miss the point of failure.
So we're kind of hurtling into the final kind of stages today, and we're going to leave it with some closing advice from all three of you. So then put Peter on the spot as well for this one. So to a teacher who has a student struggling to engage with what is one tiny environmental tweak they can try right now to help their student feel successful? You kind of just answered it slightly there, James, anyway. I'll let your NFT.
I'm going to jump in on this one first, if you don't mind, because it's one that I had early on in my teaching career, because I went into teaching later in life and I did the 3-year primary BA. So I had 3 years of being told what good education was. And that was around getting students to collaborate around tables and group work. And in my first year of teaching, that was amazing. My second year of teaching, I had a class that couldn't look at each other without throwing a shoe at each other. And it took me 2 weeks, and I went to the head of behaviour and went, what can we do? And the first thing we did was put barriers in around all the desks. And if my university lecturers would have seen it, they'd have had a heart attack. But in that room, I had every child faced at a wall with barriers on either side of them, and they had their own learning spaces. And it changed the behaviour overnight. Now, that is something that if you don't understand could potentially look so negative. But in that room, it cut out 90% of my behaviours in the first week. I then rolled that in and kept the barriers to my second class, who were 4 years older, all in year 11, and they loved the barriers. One of the girls I had in that class asked if she could have one behind her and above her because she wanted to work in a box. And realistically, when we think about it, I know I'm most productive when I don't have eye contact with another human being. Like Mollie will know firsthand, any time you're in a room with me and you are within my eyesight, there will be a conversation happening. And I think for me, it's being brave with that classroom layout and maybe questioning, is everything you're being told reliable, or do you need to step outside that box?
Nice.
I'm going to say language, getting the language right. And I'm going to come back to the point I started off, and Peter's heard me say, and Matt's heard me say the story before, but I misnamed a child for 2 years and I never had a connection with that child. Now, he came to my class, he was a refugee. He said his name was Abil Dad. And on the last day with me, he said, "Why'd you call me Abil Dad?" And I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "No, my name's Abil." And what we'd done, Abil's dad, who didn't speak English, had signed a form, or thought he'd signed a form, and he's written Abil's dad. Now, we'd called him that name. Now, we laugh at that. I still know this boy. He comes in, he talks at our school. He's lovely. Did a bit of study. You mention a child's name 6,000 times on average in a primary classroom. Now, Abil was mentioned more than 6,000 times. He was more than one of those. He was one of those. But you get one chance to get that first impression right. We've all done that bit where we don't name the child. We call them darling or sweetheart or mate or whatever. Give them the dignity of learning their name. And so, that's probably going back to source, but we make sure we know every single person's name. We also make sure we teach every single child the word toilet in English, because it's the only one word when you're 4 years old, you need to know in English. And then you use language as a bridge. What language, how do you say your name? What do you want to be called? Is there a language match? And if there's not, I use digital. Be brave, use digital, use the thing that's in your classroom. Peter said it. Google Translate now is unbelievable. In the classroom, you can have closed captions in mother tongue. They've even developed something now where you can sign. A bot is signing BSL. So give them a voice, hear their voice. One of our school's motto is, you see me, you hear me, you belong. And I'll stand by that, And our motto is, happy children and young people learn. You're happy if you belong. So build belonging as quickly as you can. Can't do that quicker than knowing someone's name.
Nice. I think my advice would be, ask the student. And I think we're often a bit scared or reluctant to do that because it is slightly admitting failure. But as we've spoken about on this, throughout this conversation, our students do know best, and they will gravitate to what is right in that moment. And it might be what's right today is completely different from what was right yesterday. And by having that conversation and again, you're making that connection with that student, you're giving them a voice because you're asking them, what do you need? What can we change? If you are lucky enough to have options, and giving those options, would you like to stand at the back today? Would you like a beanbag? Would you like to sit on my chair today? Sit at the teacher's desk. But asking those students and inviting those conversations and finding out why they're struggling to engage.
I would just say everyone has that option. You might not believe it, but you do. Like I know it's going to be such an unpopular thing to say, but you do. In my second student placement, I was in a very traditional primary school, and I had a very great teacher. She was amazing. She would listen, she would adapt, but she was in a very traditional environment and was judged in a very traditional way. And it was about getting all the students to sit and raise their hand to answer a question. There was one child that was just up out of his seat all the time, constantly getting in trouble. And I turned around one day and said, "Why is that a problem?" And she was like, "What?" I was like, "Why is it a problem?" And she went, "Well, it's just the rule." I was like, "But why is that a problem? Like, he can't help it. He's not misbehaving. He's really excited." And the next day she was like, "Right, then let's scrap that rule and I'll take that on the chin." And then they had a jump out your seat policy to answer questions. And the whole class started jumping out of their seat to answer questions. And it was amazing. And that was just one little conversation and one little tweak. And she took it on the chin. And we did it for the rest of the year. And I know that she did it for the rest of the year after I left. And then she ended up leaving that school, which I think says a lot, though, about that journey. Like, people do have that option, and be brave and question it.
Yeah.
I think that's everything. Matt, do we have an episode 8 lined up?
We do. We've got to book it in, but we do. We're bringing everyone back together, aren't we? We're bringing.
Oh, we're having a party episode, aren't we?
Yeah. We're going to bring all of the educators to argue. Who's best? Primary, secondary, post 16?
Nursery, EYFS is always best.
Yeah.
Let the 3-year-olds decide how we do it. I promise you, we'd be in a better place.
But that's been the fascinating thing doing these past 4 episodes, has just been, I want to say, the trail between all of them. That they've been so linked that I don't think anybody going into it would realize how linked they have been.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the next one. We'll call it the party episode.
I like the idea of party episode. Maybe we'll invite Mason along for it. He's 18 now, so
get him on. He's
absolutely.
Right,
guys, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for being here for it. James, Mollie, thanks so much for giving up your time and being part of the episode. It's meant a great thing, and I think it's been really nice having the voice of therapist, mat leader, teachers. It's been a great little snippet, and I'm really looking forward for this episode to get out in the world.
Thank you, and apologies for the misfiring of not turning up the first time.
If you hadn't mentioned it, no one would have known.
I didn't have an NFT tag to remind me. I will have to do one. Brilliant.